All right, I think we're live. We'll get started in just about 60 seconds. So hang on. All right, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. This is the first supplementary workshop to the official Bitcoin 2025 Hackathon. We're super excited to be here with Maestro, a super strong partner of the Hackathon, a super big supporter. They are a Bitcoin infrastructure company that helps developers. Sorry, the sound feedback. Yeah, so Maestro, if you're not unfamiliar with them, is a Bitcoin infrastructure company that specializes in developer toolings to help developers build applications that use Bitcoin. So we are here today with John, the head of developer experience, and Vard as the co-founder and CTO of Maestro. So thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you for being involved in the hackathon. In addition to this workshop, Maestro's also generously offered to give every hacker at this hackathon a free subscription of their premium conductor tier of their service. So if you go to b25.devpost.com and check out the resources section, there's instructions about how to obtain a free subscription of their service through the end of the hackathon. So without further ado, John Vardez, kick it off.
Great. Thanks, Alex. So, hello, Bitcoin builders. Um, Welcome to the B25 workshop with Maestro. Thanks for the intro, Alex, and for putting us, putting it on and having us here. I've lost video. I hope you guys can still see me.
Yeah, we can see you.
Okay. So, I'm John, and as Alex said, I handle developer experience. I'll share my screen here. We'll get going. So I'm going to jump back and forth in between this presentation as well as a couple other tabs to kind of help you guys out. But today we'll be showcasing our MCP server as well as some of our services that can assist with building on Bitcoin. So here's an overview of the APIs that we provide for Bitcoin developers. And we'll start off at the top here. Our blockchain indexer, with support for meta protocols, such as ordinals and runes, BRC20s, of course. We have a mempool monitor API, which also indexes. We have an event manager, a market price feed, and a node RPC API as well. So we'll touch on each of these services, in the following slides in greater detail. But this provides you with an overview. So why Maestro? As a builder, you want to be focused on the business logic of your dApp. Refining it, ensuring a fluid experience for all your users and the ecosystem. So what you don't want is to be burdened with heavy technical overhead that requires more time to stand up, manage, maybe even a larger team to support and maintain this infrastructure going forward. So what this practically looks like when building on Bitcoin or in Web3 in general, I guess we could say, is running and syncing a full node, building, running, and maintaining an indexer, supporting meta protocols, which may include actually running an additional client like ORD, and then probably parsing the data and making use of it, as well as maintaining aggregate price feeds, if of course you're operating in the DeFi space. So again, all of this, can provide a distraction and otherwise consume, bandwidth and precious resources away from the main focus, which should be crafting and refining your business logic. So Maestro, we allow you to abstract away all of this friction, when you're getting started, and also as you continue to build, which really allows you to focus on creating and sustaining velocity and growth for your dApp development. We also provide, select tailored support to teams that are looking for more custom solutions. So if something isn't here that you need, or if you're trying to target a use case that isn't otherwise listed here, just let us know, reach out, and we can see about supporting that, if it makes sense and if it can help you. So really this, allows you to, instead of spending your time thinking like, how can I get the data I need? Where is it? And what do I have to do to get it? There's a ton of parsing, and that could take a lot of effort and a lot of work. And not only just a one-time thing, there's continuous maintenance on this, because if anything changes the spec, you have to go back. So it shifts your focus to more on like, how can I use this data to build something great and create value for the ecosystem? That's really where you want to be. So our first service we'll just take a look at here, and this is our blockchain indexer API. And this service provides fast access to structured, essentially cached chain data. Allows for efficient retrieval of this information, such as transactions and blocks, address, and stuff like this. So we'll get into some of these categories, and I'll show you Postman. Actually, we'll go into that probably towards the end of this presentation, just so it's not so distracting going back and forth. And this will get really interesting when we're looking at the MCP, which we'll touch on at the end of this presentation. So how this could look practically with something like the MCP, where you could ask it to fetch the latest block. And then with that latest block information, you then take that and see if there's any inscription or rune activity for that block. So that would be a way of like chaining these endpoints and this functionality together. So once you get data from one endpoint, you can take it and use it in another. And the MCP will make that really clear. So here's an example of a showcase of an endpoint. We won't do this for each of the services, but for now it may help you. So here's an example of getting UTXOs by address. So you can see here there's the address that you would pass in, and that's configurable. It's like a variable basically. You pass that in the URL string, and this is your corresponding data that you would get back. It'd be this block. That would provide the transaction ID as well as other things that you may need within your dApp. So looking at this example, this endpoint, UTXOs by address. In order to do this on your own, you would need a custom indexing solution. You can't simply ask the chain for this data, since Bitcoin doesn't operate on an account model. So getting the balance for an address may seem like a simple request. And many of you may already know this, but we're kind of starting from scratch because we don't know, the builders in the audience, what the baseline level of knowledge is when working on Bitcoin. So getting the balance for an address, like I said, it may seem like a simple request, but there's actually quite a lot going on behind the scenes. So, and this is like what wallets would provide. They would do all of this for you and then present you with like, hey, you have 5 Bitcoin. But really, in order to get that 5 Bitcoin total, they've had to do a ton of work to provide that information, that aggregate. So what this looks like is, combining all of the unspent transaction, the UTXOs, so for an address, and then adding those all up to be able to create this balance. So calculating that and then providing it back to the user. And this is all made possible by going back through, the historical chain data. And this isn't just for balances. Like this could be, get me all the transactions for this address, or if looking at meta protocols, for example, get me the token balance for this address, or what are the pending transactions in the mempool, for example. So there's tons of examples that you would need, or tons of use cases that you could address by using an API like this. So the next service we have is the Node RPC, and this one, we won't spend a whole lot of time on. It's pretty straightforward. but it's essentially a wrapper for interacting with the Bitcoin RPC nodes. Um, Whereas the Bitcoin RPC node may provide like raw data back to you. This is a little bit more structured, and essentially we run the nodes so you don't have to, which definitely, going back to one of the previous slides, like alleviates a lot of that overhead that you don't have to deal with. Not only just setting up, the node, but also ensuring that it stays in sync continuously, um, which isn't trivial. Next, we have the mempool monitoring API. And this service indexes a node's mempool as well as provides insight on this data. So, practically speaking, looking at a dApp that might use this, it's useful for like showcasing the status of a pending transaction, for example. And this may help you and your dApp provide a more like informed user experience. So you can have like a little spinning wheel in the bottom left, like the transaction's still pending. And this actually is a nice segue into the next API we provide, which is an event manager. So I guess previously when working on blockchains, you're constantly having to like ping the RPC node, like, hey, is this transaction confirmed yet? Is this set? And so instead of having to ping like, are you done? Are you done? Are you done? Instead, now the event manager can just let you know when an event has been emitted. So these are just webhooks basically, which can trigger based on specific events that the chain emits, like I said. So this allows for a much more responsive dApp experience. And so you don't have to make as many calls to the RPC node now, like has this happened yet a million times. You just let the webhook inform you when the event has occurred. So this is kind of like a subscription. The next service we have for Bitcoin, the last one, is the market price API. And I say last one, but we're constantly releasing new services, so always be on the lookout for something else. But this one specifically, targets those probably working in the DeFi space. So if you need like aggregate market price feeds, this is something that you might want to look into. And since there's no Oracle layer for Bitcoin pricing, like Bitcoin builders would need to integrate these third-party APIs. So this may include CoinMarketCap, CoinGecko, things like this, and run these external data pipelines and ensure that these feeds are timely for sure, ensure that they're accurate, and especially if they're building in any kind of DeFi use case. So one such example of, you see the categorical data we provide for DEXs would be like, okay, so first you would fetch supported DEXs. That's just an endpoint. What are the supported DEXs? So let's say it returns Magic Eden. Okay, so once you have the Magic Eden as a DEX, you could say like, let's look at the rune trades for this specific DEX. So then you'd pass in, Magic Eden, and then maybe a specific rune ID, which might be like dog go to moon, for example. And we'll show what that might look like when we get to the MCP section. But this allows you to get the trade history given a specific rune for a specific DEX. Okay, so now we get to the MCP. So I think this is a good time to just showcase real quick what Postman looks like, and then we'll come back to this MCP section. So let me drop out of this. I'll click into here. Looks like everybody can still see this screen. Okay, so here we are in Postman, and this is our main source of documentation. And not only is it just documentation that allows you to understand more about this collection, which each collection holds, these are the categories of endpoints within this collection. So we'll look at the blockchain indexer collection, for example, this service, and then within it we'll get into one of the specific endpoints. But this allows you to not only understand a little bit about what goes into it, if there's any query parameters that need to be adjusted, or maybe there's some sort of post data that needs to be added, especially if you're going to do like, if there's a posting transaction that's needed. We'll get down here actually, that will look into something like this where you need to send a transaction, what that raw transaction data would look like. But it also allows you to make these calls from within here. So first, since this is an API, we need to generate an API key. So we're assuming that some of you as hackathon participants have actually gone through and created a Maestro account. And practically speaking, this is what the dashboard would look like. So you come down here, maybe you have a couple other projects you're working on. In this case, for this demo, we'll just generate a new project. So we'll have B25, and then we'll use Bitcoin. Network will be mainnet. We'll create this. Okay, so now we'll create an API key. So we'll call it B25, Bitcoin, mainnet, save. This will generate our API key. We'll copy this. Now, ideally, I shouldn't be sharing this API key with you all, of course, but for the sake of this presentation, it's fine, and I'll go back and delete this, rest assured. So there's no funny business, but I'm going to store this somewhere so I can use it again. So we'll store the key here. Here's my API key. Okay. Okay, so let's go back into Postman. So this is the steps that you would take. These are the steps where if you wanted to start interacting with Postman, you'd first need to add in authorization. In this case, we'll use an API key. So we'll replace this. You may find there's a variable here, and we can put out additional videos on how to do this. This is just going to be kind of a quick and dirty on us using Postman, but rest assured there is a better way to do this, and we'll be showcasing this in follow-up videos. So we'll paste in our API key here. It will give me a warning and saying basically this is a bad idea, but we're going to do it anyway because it makes things pretty quick. So we'll save that. Now saving the API key at the collection, the parent level, will allow all of the child categories, for example, addresses or BRC20, any one of these. It'll allow all the child categories to be able to have access to this API key. So we don't have to pass it in each time. This is super nice. So this parent now has the API key stored. We'll go into one of the endpoints, which as you can still see the path here, we have the blockchain indexer API, followed by the category of addresses, and then the specific endpoint, UTXOs by address. And here's the URL. We'll make sure that the base URL is actually mainnet, which corresponds with our key that we created, which is also down here, mainnet. So if you're having any issues, make sure these values are the same. Of course, this isn't like testnet, but you could change that if you wanted. We're just not going to do that. So make sure this corresponds to the API key that you created. Now we'll go into the authorization headers to make sure that that key passed. Looks like it did because it's being inherited from the parent. Okay, that's all good. Does it start with an HV? Let's check. HV. All right, so that worked correctly. No changes. Now let's go into the params. And we're not going to add any query string parameters. As you can see here, anything following this question mark will be known as a query string parameter. We're not going to change anything here. We can add all those. We'll just take them out for sake of simplicity. But you can add further filtering this way. So what we really want is we want to add in an address because we're trying to get the UTXOs for this specific address. So we have configured an address here to give us some information. We'll clear that to make things easy. So now that we've effectively updated our endpoint with everything that we need, ideally this should work. I'm going to run it in here, but I'm also going to take this curl request and take it over to the terminal to make it a little bit more viewable. But we'll run this. Hopefully it works. Live demo. Okay, it does. You can also go over here in the corner. How I got to here is there's this little code icon. Click into that, and that reveals a curl request. You can change the language as needed. We'll stick with curl because it's easy. This will pass in the API key for you. So be careful when you're doing this and you're sharing these code snippets because it'll include your API key. We'll go over to our terminal. We'll paste this in. We can add some cool stuff like JQ, which will colorify the output, make this a little bit easier to understand and read. And so here we go. And now you have all of this data that you can now scroll back and look at. So this allows you to just rapidly iterate on some of this endpoint information. And like I said, you don't have to use the terminal if you don't want. You can just stay within Postman. And I guess the last thing I'll mention, and this isn't really meant to be a Postman tutorial, but it would help if you created a Postman account. That way you can set these API keys and do all this stuff. That just makes the whole experience a lot better. So yeah, that's that. That's Postman. So now we'll go back to the presentation and follow up to the MCP section. Okay, here we are. Done with that. Great. Now we're at the MCP section. Okay, so what is the MCP? You may have heard about this. It's kind of been blown up on Twitter and people are talking about it. What all has to do with LLMs. And people are thinking like, well, how can we use LLMs to kind of help our development? And speed things up and maybe get us thinking in different ways. Or now it's not just about returning data, like go read this documentation and tell me how to do something. The MCP can actually be more of like an agent. It can serve as an agent in that it can take action on your behalf. Gets super interesting because now they're coming out with these agent to agent protocols, and all this stuff is about to just explode. But we'll start with the MCP and keep it really simple. So this diagram here will help you understand the MCP host. You can think of it as like the LLM client. In this case, we'll use Claude. Anthropic, the Claude's developers, they're the ones responsible for creating this MCP, or something known as the Model Context Protocol. And the MCP really allows communication between the LLM and some server. Now, it doesn't have to be a specific server. It could be anything. And we'll get to that in the next slides, where you can find a whole host of other servers that people have created. These include Stripe, there's Redis, there's all different types. GitHub has servers. We created one, like I said, and we'll show you. But any number of MCPs can be created, and the real value comes in. I'm kind of giving it away, but the next slide really talks about chaining these MCPs together. So how this works is your client, which in this case is Claude, will connect to our server, which is just any third-party server, through this protocol. And then in the background, our server will make the call to Maestro's services, which includes databases, of course, because we're indexing data directly from the chain. So we didn't create a diagram that includes Bitcoin here, but basically when our server calls Maestro, that web API, that's in the background, like calling Bitcoin, storing that data locally so that the response time is super fast. Because if we ask Bitcoin for like the balance of an address or all the UTXOs behind an address and we didn't index, that would take a long time to have to go back to the chain's history, yada, yada, yada. And that's why indexing is important, as many of us know. Also, this may be a good time to mention that we are about to open source our indexer. And so this will allow developers to, if they wish to, they can run that infrastructure on their own, and then they can build on top of it in the spirit of open source. If there's ways they can do things better, or if they want to bolt on different functionality, they can do that now. Well, that will be soon. So keep an eye on that. But getting back to the MCP here, this is our repo if you want to click into that. Here's the URL down below. I'll leave that for a second so people can read, but this will also be at the end of the presentation. We'll include like a resources page where you can find out more. And essentially it's also really important to note that this is very much in beta. We're just rolling this out. It's been like a couple weeks old. Right now it only supports Bitcoin, and it only supports some endpoints. There's only some functionality. It's certainly not completely robust. And Maestro does support other chains beyond Bitcoin, but since this is a Bitcoin workshop, we'll just keep it focused on that. But eventually our MCP will be able to support our other chains as well. And currently, this whole flow that's required of developers to interact with the Maestro MCP requires you to actually clone the repo, store the Maestro files, which is Python, is what we wrote it in, store this all locally, configure the path to those Python files. And so the server runs locally when you run like Claude Desktop, for example. But eventually you can run your Claude Desktop and you configure it to point to the remote Maestro MCP. So we'll host this MCP on some subdomain, and then you won't have to clone the repo. It'll be much easier. So we'll get to that in a second, actually. But for right now, let's talk about chaining these MCPs like I was mentioning before. So here is a list of community servers, and this repository servers within the owner account model context protocol, or MCP. This includes a ton of third-party servers. I mean, there's like hundreds of these, and we just happen to be one of those. But like I was talking about, all these other companies have either official or unofficial MCP server examples that you can find out in there. And it's not only in Python, there's a bunch of different languages that MCP now supports. So what this looks like, practically speaking, when you're wanting to chain MCPs together, here's an example that we were thinking. Is like, okay, so first you take the Maestro MCP, which would allow you to basically understand the Maestro APIs and then invoke functionality that we'll get into demoing shortly. And then once you get that data, what do you do with it? Well, you can combine it with another MCP, which maybe allows you to work with the file system, and then you can read and write data. So if I got chain data, I could then write it to my local file system. That might be kind of cool for something that I need or something that I want to save. It doesn't just save it in the context of the chat. It actually stores a file on your desktop or wherever in your file system. But then you can go further and you can say, okay, well, maybe I do want to come back to the chat and let's persist this chat memory within the client, which is going to be Claude or the LLM of choice. Let's persist that a little bit longer. So then you can drop in like a memory MCP. And you can start chaining like multiple MCPs together and create really, really interesting functionality. And the whole idea here is that it moves more in the direction to have like full stack or getting towards full stack um, interface for AI agents, to serve as kind of like LLM developer assistants. So it's moving in this direction. Now, naturally, when you're working with a blockchain and some of the functionality we have is to actually submit a transaction to post transaction data, where you, of course, since you're changing state, you actually have to pay for that. So that might be a little bit interesting, and letting the agent just go, hog wild with like spending Bitcoin, may not work for you, but there's ways to limit that. You could set an allowance, and anyway, that could be thought about later. But the whole idea is that the agent now can start to be able to do things for you, and it could be very, very sophisticated, especially when you start chaining the stuff together. So really, this is the last slide we have on MCP before I do the demo. I know this has been a little bit lengthy, but there's a lot of stuff to touch on here. The main thing is like I said, since this is in beta and we're very much still in the iteration phase of our MCP development, we definitely welcome contributors. So open issues on features that you'd want to see in the repo just here, or submit pull requests if you want to go as far as that. We even have a tutorial within our documentation page that allows you to interact with the MCP as well. And all of this tutorial is basically just a longer version of information that you would find within the repo's README. Oops. So the general flow here is you have to sign up for a Maestro account to get your API key. Once you get your API key, you need to store that somewhere, of course. An environment variable is fine. You download Claude, which is going to be a desktop application. You clone the repo, so the Maestro MCP repo. You store that data somewhere, and then you need to configure it. And we'll get into that a little bit, but I'm going to leave a lot of that out for the sake of this workshop, just because I don't want to bore everyone. And really, it's just well written in the README. Like it explains it all well, and there's also screenshots of everything in there too. So it's really clear. So that's basically the end of the presentation. Right now, I'm going to do the demo on the MCP and what that can practically look like. So let's get into that. But before I do, this is just our resources page. So in case anybody wants to know, this is our website. Here's our GitHub. This is our Twitter account, of course. And if you want to join our Discord, you can ask questions in there as well, and open tickets and stuff like that. So now let's jump into the MCP. So here's our repo. We'll just walk through this real quick. You start with the installation. There's, of course, there's Python requirements and UV, which is for, dependency management and stuff like that, as well as virtual environment. The configuration is one thing I wanted to mention. So you come down here and you'll open Claude Desktop once you download it. And this will present you with a screen where if you haven't set up an MCP before, this is what your screen is going to look like on the client. So you'll hit Edit Config, which will open a little like file browser, and everything is going to be stored for your MCP configuration within this JSON file. So you click into there, you can open that up in a text editor, which I'll show you shortly. And your path may vary, but if it's Linux or Mac, then you want to use something like this. If it's Windows, WSL probably is supported. But again, open an issue if you're running into any problems. So if you are working on your end for this, you'll see MCP servers, and MCP servers is really supposed to be a list of multiple servers. And MCP for Maestro is really just one of these. So you can start to set these side by side. Like I said, we showed the example of the file system. You can have all these MCPs next to each other. So your MCP servers like list might be very, very long, which really just allows your LLM to have all this functionality. And we'll get into what that looks like. But you configure your path to the Maestro MCP. And like I said, right now this is local, so you have to clone the repo and then make sure you have the path to this repo that you've cloned. And then you have a path to UV, the binary that you download for package dependency management. And then you make sure you have the base URL, and that corresponds with the API key that you generate within the platform. So it's mainnet. And then you pass in your API key, and you can think of this as like an environment variable. And now note this is also very important. If you ever make any changes to your, here's like the server file. If you make any changes to your file or in the configuration at all, you want to restart Claude every time. Otherwise, those changes won't go into effect. So yeah, the idea is you launch Claude Desktop, you locate the hammer icon down in the corner, and that will allow you to see the available tools. Now these tools are really just functions, and those functions do things. It can be calculations. In our case, it's web requests to the Maestro services. So that's really how that works. And when you start to chain multiple MCPs, you'll have this number start to grow because all your functionality will explode. You could have like 50 or 100 different tools. And then you chat with the LLM like, hey, not like I need to invoke this specific tool name. The LLM can do a little bit of that natural language processing to where it can start to infer which tool or function to invoke for you. And it doesn't always get it right, so you have to play with it a little bit. In our example, we have some endpoint names that are near identical, and the only difference is maybe one is mempool aware and the other isn't. So just be careful when you're interacting with it, make sure it's the function that you want. And you might have to be a little bit more explicit, especially in the case where the endpoints are really similarly named. So I'm really just walking through the README here, like this is great. And now you can start to prompt Claude with some of this functionality. So this is what I'll do in the live demo. I'm kind of giving it away, but there is one more thing I wanted to mention. There's a logs file, and yours may vary, your path, but essentially you want to identify your log file. And if there's any errors that are emanating from the MCP, this is for like total debugging. If you don't want to do that, you don't have to, but for developing on it and iterating, you'll want to be like monitoring these logs so you can tail that and see what's going on, as well as the MCP CLI is a tool that someone created that allows you to interact with this. Because what will also happen, it's also important to note that Claude, if you don't have like a more pro account or one of these like paid accounts, you have to, you'll get rate limited. So it's really helpful to actually test your functionality within the MCP CLI and not, the outside of the context of the LLM. So that's a big key right there. And as of now, right now, these are the supported endpoints. But like I said, this will all grow within the coming days and weeks. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So now we'll get into what this looks like practically using Claude. So I'm going to show you first what the configuration file looks like. Yeah, that's here. So as you can see, our API key is empty. So I generated this key from Maestro's dashboard. I then take that key, store it somewhere, and I'll put it in here as my environment variable. I'll resave this file so the next time that I open Claude, it's good to go and no errors will emanate. You can see this is my path to UV and this is my path to the MCP repo since I'm already working on it. And this is some information that I may need to start prompting the MCP. We'll start with some of this stuff. Pretty simple. All right, so we'll open Claude. And since we're using a VPN, this is happening. Okay, server disconnected. This is great for a live demo. We'll see why. And we know it disconnected not only from that error message, but also there's no hammer down here. So, that lets us know something's not working, something's not right. So let's see why this happened. We'll make sure this API key is still active. This is the one I generated, B25, mainnet. Refresh this, make sure this works correctly. Okay, 19 minutes ago. We know this works. Let's check the API key, HV. Is that the one we have? HV. All right, so this should work. Okay. We'll open Claude again. Again, we pass the CAPTCHA. And we have some more problems. Okay, this is not ideal. So let's see.
Is it just an upstream issue with Claude?
Yeah, this is an issue with Claude, it looks like. Let me take a look actually here, see if there's anything that we needed to add. Oh, you know what? It can't find the repo.
Is the MCP server running?
Yeah, it'll run when Claude launches. So let's instead, all right. Okay, we're gonna have to do some live demoing here. So we'll clone this. Okay, maybe something was going on there. So now we have a path to, you know what? I know why this is wrong. Because I changed something. Okay, I think we got it. So now I need to run Claude again, and this should work. Okay, so we have no error message, so everything worked correctly and it connected. Now again, you could also run your logs over there on the corner or somewhere in a terminal so you can see what's going on, and it'll probably tell you a little bit better than like the client where it just gives you a nice error message. So now we know this worked because we have this little hammer, and that gives us all the tools. So now we can get really creative with what we're asking. So I've ahead of time set some prompts that we'll want to check out so we can check fetching the latest block, for example. So you can just ask it straight up, like fetch the latest block. In this case, we'll say fetch the latest Bitcoin block, because if we're using more MCPs, it may get confused as to what exactly we're asking. So in this case, you can say from Maestro. And so this will prompt us to basically accept that this is going to be run from a third-party server. We'll allow that for the context of this chat. And behind the scenes, this is making a web request. And hopefully that all goes through and it's hanging. Okay, came back. And then it presents the information. So you can see here, this is kind of a receipt of the data, and it provides this massive like JSON blob. So you can expand that if you want, just kind of to make sure everything worked correctly, and it'll take that JSON and automatically format that. So instead we'll go a little further and say like, okay, fetch info for this transaction. Again, you can state from Maestro the specific service, pass that in, and then, you know, as it does its thing, behind the scenes, again, this is calling our MCP. It's saying, you know, is this exactly what you want to do? Now here's a good thing to note, like here, this is what I was talking about earlier, transaction info from the indexer. We may have a different function that says underscore mempool. So depending on what your use case is, just be aware of that. Again, the MCP does its thing, it returns all this data, nicely structures it, and here we are. And then the last one we'll show is like, we'll just ask about this rune, for example. So get info about this rune from Maestro again, and then we can just pass the rune ID. So you check rune's info, okay, that sounds good. And then here's the rune ID. And so it takes this rune ID and it turns it into, okay, there's a human readable name for that. Yeah, and that's kind of the MCP demo that we have. And this is gonna get really fun. You can start to combine all this functionality together, and hopefully this allows you to start seeing the power of the MCP and what this can mean for assisting you as a developer. So that's kind of all we have. I'll switch back here so people have a view on some of the resources that they may need. I guess if there are any questions, we'll look in the chat. I'll stop sharing here. Okay.
Hey, I have a question. Yeah, are there any projects that you're hoping to see hackers work on? Any ideas for people that are interested in using your service?
Yeah. Var, do you have any thoughts? Jump in if you do, but
Yeah, I mean, currently all kinds of different projects use the platform across the different APIs. You know, wallets, various DeFi projects, DeFi protocols, analytics platforms that need on-chain data, trading bots. I mean, you name it. So anyone building anything like that can immediately use Maestro. Anyone building anything that involves the Bitcoin meta protocols, we have a very comprehensive list of endpoints that will help build applications that interact with those meta protocols. In the case of this MCP stuff, trading bots are very interesting. So anything that needs to get information about the chain, maybe from specifically from like the Maestro index, and then take action based on that information. So construct and submit a transaction for, I don't know, a trade or a transfer or something. Those are all infinite possibilities. Um, yeah.
yeah.
That's
And
super
one
cool.
one thing I was going to add also is the MCP is meant to be more like an agent, so it's meant to take actions. And the LLM is kind of like this. You can have a conversation with it, and the idea is the LLM should have context. It should be totally aware of like all the specs that we have within our APIs, for example, all the services. You should be able to have a conversation about it. But we're thinking of building that into the MCP too, so it kind of serves two purposes. Like the MCP not only can take action, of course, as we talked about, and that's really where it'll start to go between agent to agent communication, but also you could say like, okay, now that I know how to get this data, give me a curl request or create some code snippet using that, and how can I put that into my actual project? So it becomes a little bit more like a coding assistant and a development assistant, which isn't really meant to be the use case of the MCP, but we're going to tailor it because that's really what we think people need, is this kind of chat interface and allows people to not only take action, but also, you know, take that and put it into the context of their application or their business logic.
Yeah, that's super cool. I can see that could be incredibly useful as you're developing an application using Bitcoin Meta protocols. Just having access to ask about the assets that you're dealing with without having to comb through uh, pages and pages of dashboards to find what you're looking for. Um, yeah, I'm curious just like, about more about like MCP servers. Like, have you guys seen in the wild anybody using your MCP or similar ones for uh, any specific examples of phenomenal applications or use cases using MCP already?
I did see one the other day. Let me see if I can pull it up. I actually will share the tweet here because it's really, really cool. And it had to do with ORD scan. Um, I'll share it here. Can I share it in the chat and everyone will see, hopefully?
Yeah, it looks like the Riverside chat might be a little bit botched. If you want to post it in the YouTube live stream chat, it will definitely get out.
I can. If I share it in the studio chat, will that be able to? Let's see. Yeah, thank you. So this was really cool. I mean, not only is it a really cool video because it was well edited, but it also shows, a little bit more similar to what we've made, but then it's just going a little bit further. So this kind of stuff, like we don't have any, to my knowledge, any users, at least at liberty to share what they're using our MCP for. So maybe it's, behind the scenes work, they're still tinkering with it. But you can tell the space is starting to get this momentum where people are starting to figure this out. If you look in the third-party servers list that I shared within the Model Context Protocol servers repo, there's starting to be a lot more crypto projects. And that's just one of the many repos. I mean, there's also like awesome MCP, of course, the whole awesome, type of repo standard. And there's other ones that are supported where a lot of these other crypto projects and chains are starting to support MCP. So I just think we're at the very, very beginning of a really interesting time.
Yeah, that's super cool. you have any recommendations for specific models to use? Like you've been using Claude in your demo a lot. Have you guys tried with Gemini or any of the other new models that have been released
Yeah,
recently?
that's a great question, actually. And I meant to mention that actually, so I'm glad you reminded me. So the MCP, I believe it started with Claude since Anthropic created this whole protocol, this MCP. But I've heard rumors that it's going to be, integrated within, ChatGPT, and so OpenAI is looking at it. And I'm imagining if it's not already done, it may already be done because the pace of development is exceptionally fast. I mean, I thought it was fast with blockchain, but AI is just out of control. So it's possible that it's already fully integrated with these other servers. But to answer your question, a long story short, I haven't tested it out with the other services yet. The one thing I'm wondering also is if I have to have a local, like a desktop client for each one. So if I have to have the ChatGPT, if there's a desktop client, I'm not even sure if there is, in order to be able to integrate our third-party server, or who's going to make that a little bit less. Because I mean, having to download this locally and run it all, like that's a lot of friction. So if we host it with with a remote URL, like I was talking about, we're thinking of doing that soon. That will release or reduce the friction. Still, individuals have to configure it. So hopefully this will all get worked into it down the road. Um, but I actually prefer working with like GPT, ChatGPT, and this is my first time working with Claude, and it was really only because I felt like I had to, just to demo the MCP.
Cool. Maybe another question, a bit more technical. If you were to architect a service that used MCPs, my understanding is that for each MCP, you really need like an individual server running, um, kind of for each user. If you wanted to scale an MCP service for a large number of users, how would you start to think about that?
So I mean, in this case, I mean, one thing we want to do. I mean, we just released this like a week ago, like the repo for the MCP server. But I mean, we can.
Mhm.
One of the things we're going to do in the coming weeks, we've just been a bit impacted, is simply just hosting this MCP server ourselves. Because I mean, we have like very powerful and scalable API infrastructure already, right? Like we're getting many millions of requests a day through the platform, and so we just want to put this behind our own APIs, and people don't have to worry about running the MCP server itself. So that's like immediately beneficial to everyone. If you're asking are you asking maybe more of, is that kind of answer your question, or you're asking more of a deeper question
Yeah,
on like MCP servers in general?
um, I mean that answers it to some degree. Like so the recommendation is use like a third party service if it exists that's
Mm-hmm.
that's dedicated to scale. But yeah, I guess I'm just curious, selfishly, like for tricks of the trade of um, starting to scale something like this.
Yeah, I mean the problem. Well, yeah, in this case, where it needs to scale is the server itself, because like the chat, like the chat environment, or these different agents and clients, like obviously they need to be built in such a way where it accomplishes the task that it needs to accomplish, right? Like there's more of like a product decisions there, or more like contextual understanding of those specific agents, like what they need to do. So, but I mean, in terms of like the servers, they need to be able to like handle like request load from like potentially, I don't know, thousands or tens of thousands of agents trying to query it simultaneously. And it's not really like a decentralization problem, or it's really just a server that is servicing these MCP agents, and putting it behind like powerful scalable infrastructure is the way to really solve that problem. I mean, you could go even
Gotcha.
deeper and say like, oh well, what is the MCP server actually doing, and under the hood is it scaling? Like maybe that MCP server under the hood is its own like AI agent that has to scale in its own way. But I mean, at the surface, at the gateway interaction level, like you just put it behind auto scales and all that basic stuff to make sure that
Yeah,
it's service millions of requests per second.
yeah. It just like it seems like a challenging engineering problem, given that the whole thing runs kind of on like a single user, or at least naively, it's only a single user can access it at once on like an instance of the server. Um, like, can you send concurrent requests to MCP servers by default?
Yeah, it's just a server. You know what I mean? It's really just running a Python server. And as long as that server is auto scaled and it has the proper resources under the hood in which where it's running all the basic stuff for like scalable API servers. Um, yeah, I think the tougher part of this is like everything that needs to interact with those servers. Like how are they doing what they need to do? Um, that's I think the more difficult challenge here.
Gotcha. Like making the products actually good.
Yeah, yeah, like making sure like these agents that are being built are actually useful and they're not just spending people's money for no reason.
Putting out
Like
slop. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Any advice for prompt engineering? If you're trying to build a service that produces quality results, yeah. Any tips and tricks?
Get really good at it because that you might be more valuable than senior software engineers in the next 5 years.
Yeah, and don't assume. Like, add as much context as you can. I mean, that for me, that's the biggest one. Like, set the stage. Like, who are you? And when I mean, depends on the prompt, of course. But if you're like looking for advice or something, and it's like, okay, well, don't just ask the question. Like, set the stage. What are you like? Who are you? What are you coming from? Where are you coming from? Who are you? What do you need? Yeah, I would just say the more information, the better, and be very descriptive. So for me, it's really helped me be very, very descriptive in what I want. And if I get a bad response, naturally it's like, oh, this is bad tech. It's like, no, it's actually starting to be much more on the user. The onus is on the user to be as descriptive as possible. So stuff is getting so good now. Maybe in the early forms when it's in its infancy, like, okay, the responses maybe weren't perfect, but now the responses are much more in control based on the prompt that you give. So it's like if you get a bad response, chances are it's probably just because you made a poor or not very descriptive prompt. And so it's like take a look at that and carefully assess and maybe even clear the context, because I've had chats where it's like I've asked different questions within the context of a single chat, and it's started to like pull and like, oh shoot, no, I didn't want you to reference this previous conversation. So just being aware of stuff like that, I think is also important.
Gotcha. Yeah. No, all good advice. I don't know. Have you guys come across any of the kind of template prompts about like threatening the life of the AI and to make it work harder? Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? People raise the stakes by saying like the world will end if you can't help help the user or answer their question. Have you found that to be helpful?
I've done far worse than that. No, I'm kidding. But I don't think that helps, does it? I mean, does that actually push them to work harder? I have
I
no
don't know.
idea.
Yes, so it broke Twitter a few weeks ago that somebody like reversed, I think it was Windsurf's system prompt, or they extracted Windsurf system prompt and found that they were threatening the AI's like family if they don't like fulfill the user's request or something to get it to work harder. And yeah, so it seems like
Man,
it's a
are
pattern that
we
people are
get, are we
trying at
getting into
least.
like a are we getting into like the ethics of like artificial beings now? Like how we treat them? Like are we in that territory already?
I mean, that's not. Yeah, I was asking if it's effective. Not even if it's ethical yet. I guess that's a natural follow up, but um, I don't know if it's a machine. Anything to get it to work harder. Doesn't seem so bad.
So we know what side you're on now.
Yeah, yeah, pro-human. Yeah,
Yeah, pro-human.
cool. Yeah, so we got a
Well,
few
I
minutes
always
left.
found the
Yeah,
alignment problem. Now that we're in this territory, I always found the alignment problem probably as an unsolvable one. I mean, it's the problem with alignment is you can get away from the AI just keeps getting more intelligent and continuing to do its own thing because like what you do is like what you're trying to do is like in the case of like I don't know deep fake detection or something like some kind of task where you're trying to like separate between what an agent AI agent did and what a human did. the way you solve that problem, quote unquote, is you you try to get the AI to you build another AI that gets good at distinguishing between AI and humans, which just further empowers the AI and makes it smarter. So then you're like, it doesn't actually do anything, I think, with human alignment. It just makes the AI more powerful. But that's kind of opinionated. Anyway, we could probably
Yeah,
talk about
I,
that.
all good. Yeah, no, just it's 2 cents. Like I've heard the state of the art for alignment is basically try to like build a lie detector, a perfect lie detector, and if you can do that, then you basically can know if you're misaligned. And the state of the art for lie detection is not to like actually use a lie detector, but it's effectively to get the AI drunk and see if it changes its answers. Like put junk in its brain, like try to like make it drunk literally, or not literally, but make it yeah analogous to drunk, and then see if its answers change when its guard is down. Um,
Mhm.
Anywho, yeah, long discussion. Yeah, we've got a few minutes left. Is there anything else you guys want to talk about before we wrap? Any other advice you want to give hackers or
I mean, I guess I'll
yeah.
just say like Web3 development is hard. It's not easy, and that's what we've tried to, or I've tried to, explain here in this presentation is like there's a lot of stuff you have to think about, um, running when you start getting into development. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people that are really excited about Web3 development, and they come in and I mean, Bitcoin's obviously just one of the many areas that you could spend your time on in Web3, but it's like they get really excited about it and they come in and it's like, oh, wow, there's a lot here that I didn't think about. I didn't really think about an indexer. I've never really had to worry about that so much. And that's just one of the many. And then also having this node to be able to communicate with, to craft transactions, to create the transactions, to sign the transaction. Like there's a lot of work. And then the user experience and how this impacts and like, not only just submitting and pressing a button and paying for it with some sort of wallet to make sure that the wallet is even the wallet supports the most recent Bitcoin testnet. There are many providers actually that don't even support the Bitcoin testnet 4. And that's actually where there's a lot of activity happening for runes and a lot of these meta protocols. So it's like always staying abreast with the newest changes. I think I just joined Maestro within, about 3 weeks ago or so. So still relatively new. But one thing that definitely impressed me about them, even prior to joining, and I'm not getting paid to say that. Well, I am getting paid to say this, but I would have said it, irrespective whether I worked at the company or not. But they're always thinking about staying where the builders need them to be. So like we're going to conferences a lot. VAR just got back from I believe it was called OpNext out of DC, and it was mostly whiteboarding and very technical conversations, and being on the ground with what the builders are talking about and what they need, and bringing that back into the product to inform how to move forward and give people what they need so that when they join, they get involved in Web3 development and they get really excited about their use case. And then they realize they're going to get bogged down by all this infrastructural overhead that they have to deploy. It's like you have these infrastructure providers there that can really start to be your like friends in your development space. And not only is it like, yeah, they have services that will help us access data and do certain things with the chain, but also we could talk to them, we can call them, we can get on their Telegram channel, we can like go on Discord and like ask them questions like, hey, this is what I'm thinking, does this make sense? And it becomes more of like an ally, a companion in your building process. So I think that's really what's impressed me most about the team is they're very, very forward thinking, and they want to be on the ground with these developers, not just talking about it, but with them at these conferences and abreast with the conversation and how it's evolving. So I just think that's important for builders to know. Like people coming into an ecosystem, you're kind of like, where do I start and why do I feel alone? And who do I go to help me feel less like there's a ton of stuff to learn and I don't really know where to go. And there's a lot of guides on the internet, there's a lot of providers, a lot of services, but I don't want to be like isolated and you don't want to be marooned either if you start relying on a service and then you find out that the service gets deprecated. Like there's just a lot there that I think is really important for builders who are new to the space. I mean, the seasoned ones already know this stuff, but the new builders, like the ones that may be a part of hackathons, like, where do you go to get your idea off the ground the fastest? And it's like relying on providers really is the way to go. But it doesn't mean you just start there and then eventually peel off. You can, and that's why we're moving into this like we'll open our own indexer, open source that, So if you want to run that on your own, if you want more control, you can start to have that. Um, but yeah, I mean, I can just keep going, but it's like when I first got into Web3 development, that's what it was like. Okay, it was a paradigm shift. Like I'm used to Web2 development and not having to pay to change state. Like all of this stuff changes, and um, I don't know. I mean, just walking through that mentally, and that's actually where the LLM I think can really help. It can help you soundboard and like work through ideas. Like, what do I really need, and who are the providers that can give me that data? So, yeah, the LLM is really great for just working through ideas and helping you iterate before you start building. I think a lot of people don't spend enough time on that. It's kind of like the pseudo code they call it, where you're like outlining what you want to build before you start building it. Um, anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, one other thing to throw in is show up in person to conferences, like and participate in hackathons. Yeah, so if you participate in the B25 official hackathon, you get a free ticket to the Vegas conference. Super excited for that. So get yourself to an in-person Bitcoin event, as well as there's going to be other Bitcoin Plus Plus events to go to throughout the year. As there's one in Austin coming up in a couple of weeks. But yeah, more hackathons, more participation, get involved in the community. Um, John, Bartes, this has been phenomenal. Thank you guys so much for being involved in the B25 official hackathon. Appreciate y'all's time. Any closing thoughts?
No, thanks a lot for having us. I'll actually be at the Austin at Austin event in a few weeks, or I guess it's in May, right? Yeah, May 7th.
Yep.
So looking forward to seeing people there. Please don't hesitate to come up and ask about Maestro. Happy to help any project that's interested.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Well, we'll see you there. Thanks everybody for listening in, and we'll see you on Discord.
Thank you.
Bye bye.